today, whose presentation is titled, How to Be a Noxious Weed Warrior, a Guide to the Identification and Management of Weeds That Matter in the San Juans. Jason is the coordinator of the San Juan County Noxious Weed Control Program. He is well known in the islands for his wealth of botanical knowledge and his conscientious, collaborative approach, I'm sure you would all agree, to noxious weed management in the islands. He can often be spotted out and about fighting the weeds that he sees and we try to ignore. He earned his master's degree from the University of Washington, where he studied restoration ecology in the College of Forest Resources. Before moving to the San Juans in 2010, he trained as a master gardener at the Oregon State University Master Gardeners Program. Please welcome Jason.
Yes. Okay, am I on? Can you hear me okay online? All right. That's good. Oh, there we go. Okay, my name is Jason Ontjes. Thanks, Kate, for the introduction. And I understand you had another speaker in mind who couldn't make it. So thanks for taking me on short notice. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. It's about 87 slides, so I'll have to go quickly to make it. It's 50 minutes, right, or thereabouts. Yeah. So this is in reference to your other speaker, and it says comparison is the thief of joy, Mittens. So don't think too much about that other speaker. Came out of the New Yorker. We just saw that earlier this week. Okay, so this is who we are. I work for San Juan County. However, my program is within WSU Extension. It's a kind of a strange arrangement, and that's on account of its creation back in the 1990s. The extension director at the time, Tom Schultz, helped to get us started. So we've always been under that umbrella, but we are county employees. I'm based out of East Sound, as you can see, just down the street. There's my contact information, and that will come up on the screen again at the end. So if you guys have any questions that aren't answered during this presentation, you can always call or email me. I'm usually pretty responsive, except in the summertime when it gets really busy, and then I might ignore you. Okay, so we have a noxious weed board, and some of you have heard this presentation several times before. The Master Gardeners, I give this talk every couple of years with slight variations, but we have 5 members. Brooke Brower, our extension director, is on the board, a non-voting member. And we have 2 members on Orcas, 2 on San Juan, and 1 on Lopez. And they serve 4-year terms, I believe. And then we have myself and Michelle Smith as our field specialist, and she's based on San Juan. And we may be adding another field specialist in the coming months. So you may be seeing another person around on Orcas, hopefully. And then we have a few seasonal employees as well. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. What we do, some definitions of noxious weeds. I'll go a little bit over noxious weed law, which might put some of you to sleep. Describe some of the impacts of noxious weeds. And then I'll show a lot of photos of different noxious weeds in our area, and some that are not on the list, but probably you should be aware of just because they are weedy. And then I'll go over a couple of resources at the end. And at the very end, I'll talk about integrated weed management, which is basically like integrated pest management, but applied to weeds for the weed warrior. Okay, so these are some of the things we do, and at the very top of the list is providing information and outreach, which is why I'm here today. We also distribute publications you see on the table over there. And for those of you online, we do have a website where you can get a lot of this from either from our website or from the state weed board. Almost all the same materials are available. And for those of you who have noxious weeds, it sounds like some of you do. We do come out to properties and we evaluate what you have, and we can develop a plan for you if that's something you want to do, or just help you identify what it is you have and offer suggestions of control. So we do that quite a lot. And we also do some of the weed control work. If it's something that's really difficult, we can come out and help. So we help to identify plants. A lot of times people will send us photos and say, what is this? And usually we can get it, but sometimes it'll be kind of tough. And then I'll send it usually to someone either at the state level or University of Washington, and they usually can get it. And then we have weed wrenches. I don't know if any of you have Scotch broom, but that is something we loan out to the public here and on San Juan and Lopez. So I know some of you have taken advantage of that in the past, Gail, that neighborhood. And I don't know if you're aware of it, but we also do some contract work for state parks and Opalco. We've helped them out for the past several years, basically go into the park and control their weeds, and then hopefully they pay us. And it's a lot to do. We have a lot of different responsibilities, and we don't always get to things in a timely manner, as you probably noticed. We also work with the Youth Conservation Corps. That's now administered out of the San Juan Islands Conservation District, which is based in Friday Harbor. But in the past, we've had groups of kids here on Orcas and on San Juan and Lopez. Last year, Lopez didn't field a crew. I think probably because their formula for funding the stipends changed a bit. They're too young to make a salary. They're like 12 to 15. So they have to pay them stipends instead. And sometimes it's kind of a trick to entice them to join. As you can imagine, they probably don't enjoy pulling weeds all day. But I think a lot of parents like me really liked having our kids in it, just for the experience, but also because working families, it's nice to push them into something, especially if they can't afford summer camp. So anyway, that's something we've helped to fund for the past several years, and we're still doing it this year and probably next. So as far as what a noxious weed is, I heard a definition the other day, which was quite simple for a weed, which is any plant that's unwanted. So one man's weed is another's treasure. But if you look at the state law, it's very specific. The state law being RCW 1710, it says a plant that when established is highly destructive, competitive, or difficult to control by cultural or chemical practices. But I look at it as any non-native plant, so an introduced species that adversely impacts either agriculture or forestry or human health. We do have some that are poisonous, wildlife, ecosystems, or your property values. So a number of different things affected. I think when the law was first passed in the late 60s, it was very much focused on agriculture, as you can imagine. And not every state has that kind of law. We're one of probably a dozen or so, I would guess, that has noxious weed laws on the books. So here are the laws, and I won't go spend too much time on this, but RCW 1710, that's the basic weed law if you ever want to look it up. It talks about establishing the state weed board, as well as providing an opportunity for county weed boards and districts to get going. And that is the main thing that underpins everything we do. The following one, the WAC 16750, that's basically the noxious weed list, which I have copies of up on the table. So that changes every year. The state weed board gets together and they take suggestions from the public about what to add. And English holly was on the list this year, or for 2023, and it narrowly lost making the list, which I think made a lot of people upset, but it's grown commercially, which is probably why it was kept off, because it makes about $4 million a year, Washington State. People grow it mostly for the Christmas time, wreaths and so forth. So it's a business, and I think the state just decided to leave it off for now. So the WAC 16750 also has penalties. If you don't follow the law, then you can be fined. That's not something we normally do, but it is an option for us. So that tells you exactly how much money you would be charged if you refuse to do anything about your weeds. We don't tend to do that because we're part of Extension, and we'd rather educate first and then go from there. The other one, which you guys probably should be aware of, seeing that you're in a gardening club, is the WAC 16752, and this is also known as the prohibited plants list. And sometimes I'll stop by the plant nurseries in the area and I'll see if they have any plants that they shouldn't be selling. So that's a list that's separate from the noxious weed list. You would think they would be the same, but some on the noxious weed list are not actually on that prohibited plants list. It's actually regulated by the Department of Agriculture, so it's a little bit different. But lately they've been adding more species from the noxious weed list to the prohibited plants list, so it becomes a little bit less confusing. But if you ever see anything and you think, is this something that ought to be sold? That's the list that you ought to check. And the very last one has to do with properties that have noxious weeds. And if you've got a property that's full of weeds and you want to sell it, by law, you're supposed to disclose any noxious weeds if the local weed program has sent you a letter of notification or notice of violation. If they haven't, then you might be able to get away with selling it without getting punished for it. But that law basically protects the buyer from that. Yes.
I seem to remember that, I don't even know if this is the right word, but butterfly bush.
Mm-hmm.
That's discouraged.
I'll get to that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's coming up. Yeah.
Okay.
So these are the different classes of weeds on the noxious weed list. So there's class A. These are the ones that are very rare, but also the ones that the state absolutely wants you to eradicate. So you have to get rid of every single plant. In practice, that may not be so simple. We've had sites where we've been trying to eradicate egg leaf spurge, for example, for over 2 decades, like on a land bank property. And that's because of the soil seed bank. The plant may have seeds that remain viable in the soil for years. But those are the ones that you don't tend to see very often, but you absolutely have to get rid of if you have them. So I'll show some slides of those later. Class B, these are the ones that may be somewhat common in some parts of the state, less so in other parts, perhaps absent. So they're usually designated for control by the state. And by that, I mean, you're not supposed to allow it to spread. You're supposed to keep it from producing seed for that year. So we have quite a few of those around. In Class C, these are the really common ones. So things like bull thistle, Canada thistle, Himalayan blackberry, common cat's ear or false dandelion, the ones that you see everywhere, oxeye daisy, and you'll see pictures of those. Usually we don't require people to control them, but we advise them to. So it's basically up to the property owner to decide whether they want to do anything or not. And then the very bottom, weeds of special concern. Sorry about all the text, but these are ones that haven't officially made it on the list, but we're still studying the possibility. So I'll show you a few examples of those as well. So these are some new ones that made it to the list last year. Green alkanet may be one that you're familiar with. That's in the borage family. I haven't seen these other 3. Hanging sedge in the upper right is possibly here. It's just a very large sedge. Upper left, rough chervil. Maybe you guys have seen it. If you have, let us know. And then wild basil, the lower right. So these are some examples of the Class A weeds. And again, these are ones that you're not very likely to see. Upper left is common cordgrass or spartina. That's one you're going to see in marshlands, like on the shorelines. That particular photo was taken over in Jackson Beach on San Juan Island. So that's one that you're not likely to see very often. Giant hogweed, this is another one very similar to cow parsnip. Upper right, garlic mustard, it's only known in a couple of places on Orcas. And then the lower center, that's egg leaf spurge, a few places here on Orcas. And then the lower left is milk thistle, which it's really an attractive plant that I've only seen a couple of times out here. Class B, so here's the butterfly bush. That is on the list because it can spread in riparian zones. We don't have a lot of that kind of habitat here, and I've only seen it behave in a weedy manner on a few occasions. So it's not something we really enforce, but it is on the list. And I think for the most part, if it's in your yard, you're okay to leave it, but you could just prevent it from going to seed if you're concerned about it spreading. Poison hemlock, this is a pretty important one that we key in on for obvious reasons. Meadow knapweed, you may have seen this around on Orcas occasionally. It's a real problem on Lopez. Tansy ragwort, hopefully you've all heard of that one. Scotch broom, lower right, another one that we hammer on about quite a bit. Yellow hawkweed, bottom center, which you'll see occasionally on Orcas on the roadsides. And spurge laurel, this is another one that hopefully you know a fair amount about. So those are all class Bs. We have some more Bohemian knotweed. I've got a misspelling there. Yellow archangel, that's another ornamental we sometimes see. Common tansy, upper right, that's in gardens on occasion. Purple loosestrife, this is a big wetland weed, but fortunately only a problem in a few places. Myrtle spurge is a kind of an interesting one that's still sold in nurseries. Hasn't been a real problem out here. I just think it's the climate. It's not quite right for it. Eurasian milfoil, this is only known in one lake on San Juan Island. It's an aquatic weed. And lower left, shiny geranium. And if you learn to recognize any weed, I hope it'll be this one, because that's really taking off now here in Orcas. And these are some more bee species that you're, some of them you might see, like the herb Robert is quite common. Lesser celandine or celandine, the upper right. This is probably not something you're familiar with, but growing right outside of the bakery in town, brown bear, you'll see some. It's only around for a brief time in the spring. Policeman's helmet, this is an impatient species. I've only seen it once in the county. Scotch thistle, this is one we see occasionally in the bottom center. Common fennel, this is actually on the list, even though it's entirely edible. But if you go to San Juan Island, there's quite a lot of this over by Jackson Beach. And orange hawkweed, I threw that in there. Not that you'll see it very often, but quite attractive, and probably a lot of gardeners would love to have it. I used to have it at my property, but I think the shade eventually got it. It's just winked out on its own. Okay, so these are the class Cs. These are really common. Italian arum, this is probably one you're familiar with. That's a really difficult plant to get rid of. Blackberry, this is all over the place. A lot of people like it, so we generally don't do much about it. St. John's wort upper left, that's one that's mistaken for tansy ragwort. It's also toxic, and livestock will eat it. It can cause their skin to be especially sensitive to sunlight, and they get blisters. Bull thistle, Canada thistle, wild carrot is actually on the list. You may wonder why, and it's because it is the ancestor of all our domesticated carrots. And if it's around a place that has a carrot crop, it could potentially cross with those other cultivars and ruin their crops. So English ivy, we see this around town a bit. Teasel in the upper right, which is often mistaken for thistle, which is quite an attractive plant. So I've seen it in dried flower arrangements before. Yellow flag iris, you probably recognize, Fowler's Pond. And then common cat's ear, also known as false dandelion. Virtually everyone's lawn has that around. So that's on the list because it's toxic to horses, potentially. More class Cs, buffalo burr, you're not likely to see in the upper right. I should use this pointer. There we are. And common groundsel up here. This is a toxic plant. You see it often in gardens, formal landscapes, lawns. It's a wimpy plant. It's an annual, but it is toxic. So it's on the list. Green alkanet. This is one that just got added. Hoary cress, you're not likely to see this here. It's only on San Juan, but it's toxic to livestock. Field vineweed, you probably all have some experience with morning glory or vineweed. That's another difficult one. And oxeye daisy here on the list. contaminant of pastures and hay fields. Big problem on Lopez. And English hawthorn that was used years ago for a hedge for tame livestock. And this is old man's beard, or Clematis metalla, which we have a lot of in the East Sound area. So more seeds. I don't know if you recognize this one in the upper right. This is lawn weed. It's a tiny, tiny little plant. It took me a while to recognize that, but it's really everywhere. If you have grass, you probably have lawn weed. And along the shorelines too, I think it's getting spread to some of the outer islands by kayakers. In the middle, this is perennial sow thistle, which we're battling on the shorelines of some of our state parks, like up at Susha Island. And this is fragrant water lily. Again, that's Fowler's Pond, so it's a land bank. It's covered much of the water surface there. And this may be surprising to some of you. This is baby's breath, which is pretty common in dried flower arrangements. I've only seen it a couple times in ditches along roadsides. That's on the list, but we don't see much of it here. And then this here, pampas grass, is also on the list, which again, I haven't seen it behave in a weedy manner here, but in some locales it can spread. And this is reed canary grass, which you'll find in virtually any wet area, ditches, things like that. So as far as why do they matter, I've alluded to some of this already. Noxious weeds impact agriculture. They can affect public health and safety. Forestry, Scotch broom, for example, can exclude tree seedlings and suppress the trees. They can exclude both native flora and fauna. Wetlands and intertidal zone. I talked about Spartina earlier, the cordgrass, and then recreation and property values. So as far as the cost, there's millions of dollars that can be linked to noxious weeds, and these numbers are several years old, but suffice it to say that it's a big impact, and we spend a lot of money fighting them. So if you can get it early, that's the best thing. Prevention is the main thing. So this is one of the toxic plants, giant hogweed. Looks very similar to cow parsnip. This is Judy Jackson, who was the coordinator before I was, and she's holding a leaf with a gloved hand. If you get the sap on your skin and it's exposed to ultraviolet light, it can cause severe blistering and even scarring. There was a small child a few years ago that got into it over on Lopez at Fisherman Bay Spit Preserve, and the mother showed me photographs, and yeah, he had the red splotches on his face. She didn't know what it was. So that's a Class A weed. This is Rich Lee. He was the original coordinator of the program, and he is there next to some native cow parsnips. So they're both the genus Heracleum. They're both in the Apiaceae or the carrot family, and they have very similar leaves and flowers, and it's basically just a size difference. You see that the flowers on the giant hogweed are just massive, and the leaves likewise are really large. And there's some other differences like hairs, red splotching, and so forth, but it's mainly the size. This is the last one I've seen. This is a few years ago in Friday Harbor in a person's yard that got called in by the town, one of their employees. So this is poison hemlock, and Rich again standing in the photo, and these can get quite tall. Rich is a tall man. He's probably like 6'6" or something, and these plants are taller than he is. So they can get anywhere from a foot tall if it's mowed up to 7 or 8 feet tall, depending on the site. But again, it's in that carrot family, the Apiaceae. So we have had accidental poisonings, people who mistake it for carrots. It has the same fleshy taproot. But you can see on the left, the red splotching. This is a really distinct characteristic of poison hemlock. This is the second year. It's a biennial, so that's in the second year it grows tall and flowers, but those red splotches are a giveaway. It also, you may notice, doesn't have much in the way of hairs on the stems or the leaves. Here are the leaves here in the lower right, very shiny, usually a darker green. And then you've got the flower head, the classic umbrella shape. So there's one we saw on San Juan Island on the left, and on the right, you can see that long white taproot that was from Lopez, and the lower right, more of the first year rosettes. And here's Queen Anne's lace, which is a noxious weed, but fortunately not toxic for the most part. You can see it's quite hairy. It has the same flowers. That's the main difference. And also it's just size. It doesn't get as big typically as poison hemlock. The stems are supposedly hollow, but when they're still alive, you cut it open, you won't really notice that. It'll look like a solid interior. But once it dies, then you'll see that it becomes hollow. There's an example of Queen Anne's lace. So Lopez has a lot of this. And again, the hairiness of the leaves on Queen Anne's lace on the right, pretty evident. And on the left, poison hemlock, it's pretty much without hairs. Spurge laurel. So this is one you guys should get to know if you don't already. This is originally an ornamental plant that I understand was first sold in the county back in the 1950s. Some people still like it as an ornamental plant. It is quite attractive. It requires zero maintenance. Almost nothing will kill it except if we intervene. But you can see what happens. Once it gets established, like in the forest settings in particular, it just really can take off, just prolific production from seed. It can also grow vegetatively sometimes, but it's almost always from seed, is what I've seen. On the right, you can see this is another population. This came from Mount Dallas, and there are acres of spurge laurel out there. We've been trying to help the neighbors out there, but it's a really difficult site. It's steep, it's wooded, hard to get to, and there aren't enough bodies to get out there and pull it. And it is toxic. All parts of the plant are toxic. Cindy Wolf, our council person, her daughter actually ate some of the berries when she was a young child at one of the schools and got very, very sick. So this is in particular the species, it's important to her, and she was on our board, the liaison for the first year. But you can see a very attractive plant. It's got these yellow-green flowers, which can be pollinated by moths or bees, but since it appears in the wintertime, I think it's mostly moths, nocturnal moths, I'm told. But you should be seeing those pretty soon if you have this on your property. I've seen it bloom as early as December. So anyway, that's one we take pretty seriously because of the toxicity. And here's some seedlings in the upper left and some of the places we've seen it around. It's on all the main islands. Tansy ragwort, this is another one. It's got alkaloids that can accumulate in the liver and can kill livestock and humans, pets. The only animal that is somewhat less susceptible would be sheep. They can apparently metabolize it, but I've been told by an owner of sheep that her sheep died from eating tansy. So it's not always the case. So this is another one we take really seriously. This is a class B. It is required to be controlled. On the right, you can see there's a large stand there. Upper left, it's a biennial usually. So you can see in the upper left, it's got this first year rosette, and then the following spring, it may bolt and grow tall, and like the photo on the right. So it's anywhere you have ground disturbance, you're likely to see this. Here are some of the biological control agents that do eat tansy to some degree successful. The lower left one, the flea beetle, this is considered the most effective of these three because the larva, the grub, will actually go inside the root and eat it from the inside out. And then the adult will feed on the leaves and create these tiny shot holes. So it's actually naturalized. We used to have people who would call us and want to get some of it, but it's pretty well established now. Cinnabar moth, you can see, is quite attractive, the adult. Its larvae with the tiger striping, they'll eat the leaves. You know, if there are enough of them, they'll completely defoliate it. But what usually happens is the plant will bounce back and flower after they've pupated and dropped off. So they're slow to plant down. They'll reduce the amount of seeds, but it doesn't give them a complete knockout usually. And the reason they're not the favored biocontrol for tansy anymore is that they also attack native plants. There's a Pachyra species and a couple of native Senecio that this will also attack. But they'll also attack the common groundsel, which I showed you earlier, that class C. So I think on the whole, they're nice to have around, but you just have to be mindful of those other species. The last one is the tansy ragwort seed fly, and this one will lay its eggs on the flower head, and those will actually consume some of the seeds. So another reason we care about noxious weeds is potential for wildfires. Gorse in particular, this is one we have in Orcas out in Doe Bay and Oga. And there's one parcel out there that is probably a few acres of gorse. And we've been trying biocontrols on that as well with limited success. Really nasty plant. It's in the pea family, as you can see. It's got the classic pea flower. Very spiny, probably imported. Actually, I was told that the property I spoke of earlier, the person that liked the plant was, I don't know if they were from the British Isles or what, but they imported it deliberately. It's very attractive when it's blooming. The rest of the time, it just looks so nasty. But supposedly it was used for forage too. I can't imagine anything wanting to eat it. But when it's young, it's tender. It's when it gets older that it starts to get tougher. So you may have heard of Bandon, Oregon. There was a wildfire down there. I think in the 1920s that killed several people, burned much of the town to the ground. So gorse is extremely flammable. Scotch broom also, so maybe a little bit lesser extent. This is Scotch broom on the right. It doesn't have the thorns. But it obviously takes over areas, grasslands, open forests, and so it diminishes wildlife habitat on the whole. So it's another pea family member. Both species can fix nitrogen, which probably gives them a competitive advantage over some of our native species, since we have nitrogen poor soils in the Northwest typically. So this is one we require people to control. We don't always get to it though. I mean, there are places where we've watched it grow taller, and yeah, it's something we're constantly battling. And it's got an 80-year seed life potentially, so it's one of those things where you have to look over your property and just pull it every year if you're being mindful of it. It's hard to keep up. So here are some of the ways we deal with it. Pulling it out by the roots is the surest way to kill it, but you can also peel off the bark, like in that top center photograph. And that takes more time, obviously, but that will kill it. You can also cut it down to the ground and paint the stumps with an herbicide. That's another thing we do. Or you can take loppers and cut down into the root zone. If you can get down to the roots, you can kill it that way too, but it's obviously going to dull your blades somewhat. Here is richly with a weed wrench. So again, we do loan those out to the public. Very effective tool. And agriculture, as I said, the law passed in the late 1960s, and it was primarily focused on ag concerns, and St. John's wort being a toxic plant. Had killed cattle down in California back in the 20s and 30s. Many head of cattle, hundreds, I think, maybe more, I don't remember, but it's often mistaken for tansy ragwort. They're actually in two different families, but similar flowers. So you can see in the upper right, its Latin name is Hypericum perforatum, and it's called perforatum because of these oil glands on the leaves, which you can see if you hold them up under magnification. Bull and Canada thistle, these are again class Cs, really common. Ted Hughes poem, yeah, I think that speaks probably more of bull thistle, the nastier of the two species. Bull thistle is a biennial. Canada thistle is a perennial. You can see the shapes of the flowers, more urn shaped for the Canada and more like a gumball for the bull. So yeah, these are quite large, very spiny. They can go through leather gloves, no problem. But if you can get at least a portion of the taproot, you can kill it. Nice to get it in the rosette stage, or if you want to wait until it grows taller, then you can pull it before it flowers. But yeah, once it gets to the stage, then you're looking at perhaps 3 to 20 more years of dealing with it. It's funny, it's one of those species, if you cut any trees down, you're almost guaranteed to get either bull thistle, Canada thistle, or tansy, one of those three. Or any septic work, anytime there's ground disturbance, it just pops up. So it's a biennial. There's the first year rosette, got a long taproot, and then it's got the second year and it blooms. Very attractive. Canada and bull thistle both have seeds that goldfinches like, so it's not all bad. It does provide some habitat for wildlife. But yeah, you can see this just Canada thistle here tends to grow in big clonal patches. You can have very, very deep roots. So it's very hard to deal with in manual or mechanical means. You can mow it, and you can mow it, and you can mow it. It's going to keep coming back. This is a septic drain field here. So this is one we often spray, which I'll get to later on. So this is our native thistle. This is where your skills in identifying plants come into play. And this is our short-styled thistle, or Cirsium brevistylum. I use the UW website quite a lot. And if you're ever curious about one thistle versus another, you go to their website. It actually isn't working now because it was hacked recently. But it's a very good way to learn your species, whether native or not, and check them out once it's back online. Some other thistles, this is the Scotch thistle, very attractive. We have a site on Lopez that's got that. Milk thistle, again, this is class A. And slender flower, we know of this in a few places on San Juan Islands. It's another class A. So these two have to be eradicated. Scotch, I think, is a class B. So we do require bee control, but fortunately, none of these are very common. Knapweed, so this is in the Asteraceae. And this is meadow knapweed on the left, which is growing. It's about 5,000 linear feet now of Fisherman Bay Road. You can see here, this whole ditch is just filled with it. Spotted knapweed here, you can see the bracts on the flower head have these dark spots, and thus the name. There's a little bit of it on San Juan Island. Oxeye daisy, I mentioned earlier, class C, very common in some parts, the agricultural areas, pasture management, and so on. It is on the quarantine list as well. Here it is. It's a perennial. It spreads either by creeping or from seed. The seeds can last for 30 years potentially. And here are some other daisies you may have seen. English lawn daisy. I kind of like this one. It's weedy, but it's not a huge problem. Shasta daisy, this is usually just fine. Looks very similar to oxeye. Dog fennel, this is the stinky one. Pineapple weed, this is usually a pretty small annual you see in disturbed ground. And scentless mayweed, this is another one. They all look very similar. So this sometimes would be pretty tricky to key out. Common catseer, I mentioned, this is something that can be toxic to horses, very common. It's a perennial, it's got a taproot, very common in lawns, but also in sort of those mossy, rocky balls that you see. Seems to thrive in really dry environments, but another member of the Asteraceae. And English hawthorn. This photo on the right was taken in San Juan Valley several years ago before it was put on the state weed list. And when we showed the folks on the state weed board a site similar to this, they were quite shocked. This was originally introduced as a hedge for livestock. In fact, the word haw derives from, I think, an old Germanic word, which means hedge. And you can see the flowers here. I believe it's in the Rosaceae. It can hybridize with our native hawthorn. You can see on the right, it's Crataegus douglasii versus Crataegus monogyna on the left. our non-native one. So that's a really nasty plant. It's very thorny. This is interesting. Nita probably recognizes this from the photo on the left. This is a Crataegus. It's a hybrid called Lavellii. We used to recommend it in our booklet there on the table as an alternative to hawthorn. But I discovered that the folks who grow this commercially use English hawthorn as the rootstock. So you can see on the right, this is English hawthorn coming up from the ground. It must have been damaged at some point, the trunk. If you don't damage the trunk, it might be just fine. This is the top. It's obviously got these beautiful berries. But that was taken off that recommendation list because of that. Himalayan blackberry, upper right, you can see that's an old man holding a shovel. That's Luther Burbank. And back in the late 1800s, he actually promoted Himalayan blackberry in his catalog. So he distributed this to parts of the West Coast, including the Northwest. And this is what we have today. I think it's the most aggressive single noxious weed that we have around here, at least in the northwestern part of the state. English ivy, this is kind of an interesting one. So it's obviously a woody perennial vine, but it's got a juvenile phase and an adult phase. The juvenile is the leaves have these lobes like you see here, but eventually, I didn't have it there. Eventually, as it grows tall, climbs up, it's going to flower, and wasps, other things like that will pollinate it. But you can see this leaf, maybe kind of hard to see, has a different shape. That's the adult vegetation which produces the flowers. And this actually gets out to our outer islands, which is why we're concerned about it. Purple loosestrife, you're not likely to see this much around here. It's just known in a couple of places on Orcas and San Juan and perhaps Lopez, but it's a wetland species, so it can really take over shoreline areas. We've introduced a couple of biological controls, a weevil that will feed on it to some degree of success. And another wetland species, yellow flag iris, super aggressive, will take over entire shorelines of ponds or lakes. And Spartina, I mentioned earlier, the cordgrass, which again is class A, but you're not very likely to see it. That's kind of a tough one to identify unless you know your grasses, which I don't very well. Italian arum, this is an escaped ornamental. Lopez has got a real problem with it. Judy's standing next to a patch. We've been working on that patch for several years, trying to spray it every year. It's really a tough one. And I've been helping someone who lives in West Sound with her arum crop lately. We've just been digging it up, soil and all, because it's got these tiny little bulbs that can just grow again if you miss them. They're about the size of a pea. So this is lesser celandine, which is a perennial, but it drops its leaves in the summertime. And Whatcom County has a lot of it. That photo in the lower right, you can see. Very attractive ornamental, but very aggressive too. Yellow archangel, we have this in a few places in forested environments. It just loves to creep on the ground, smothers everything in its path. And it's in the mint family. It's got square stems and cross section, and very attractive, variegated leaves usually. And then the fennel, this is class B. So this is out in Friday Harbor, these photos. Myrtle spurs, this is one that is sold in nurseries and doesn't seem to be spreading out here. And on the right, you have the pampas grass, another ornamental, which local nurseries still sell. Deer don't eat either species. They're both very drought tolerant. And so far, they haven't been a problem in our county, so we're kind of letting it slide. This is not on the noxious weed list, but it's a species of concern. You have an everlasting pea vine. There are two different species, Lathyrus sylvestris and Lathyrus latifolius. So you commonly see that in ditches. The seeds are toxic to livestock. And these two species of periwinkle may surprise you. They're both creeping. I don't personally have a problem with them, but apparently in other parts of the state, they have been spreading Vinca major and Vinca minor. I think Vinca major is probably the worst of the two. And Common Mullen, Native Plant Society had a group that went out to Tip Top on Stewart Island a year ago, and we helped to control some of this. Fairly easy to pull up, so that may be why it's not on the list. I think it used to be a Class C, but extremely prolific in seeding. It can produce 100,000 seeds, which may last 100 years, something like that. So anytime you have soil disturbance, there's a good chance you'll see it. Foxglove, this is another one that might surprise you. It is weedy, but again, it's fairly easy to unearth. I mean, you can just pull them out. The rosettes, biennial, so first year rosette. But I'm seeing more and more of this in Moran State Park. I think that's where these photos came from. So it's a toxic plant, but obviously very attractive too. So it probably has some benefits for pollinators.
I have a few, and I'd rather enjoy them.
Yeah, I think they can be edited. You know, you can keep. I keep a few in my yard, but dogs, for example, they're. I don't know that anything would want to eat it, but it's one of those things where we say, oh, it's toxic. It's up to you. Garden helleborine, you probably have seen this around. It's an invasive orchid from Europe, I believe, and kind of difficult to pull out, but I'm told you could dig them out fairly easily. And it is spreading. The National Park Service is growing concerned about it because it's up in English camp. And I think an American camp as well. But an interesting plant. Its flowers produce compounds similar to codeine, so it has a narcotic effect, and it's pollinated by wasps apparently. So I guess that's part of the lure is they get intoxicated with the codeine. So it's very shade tolerant. I think it probably is hemiparasitic. It doesn't necessarily need chlorophyll. I've seen white garden helleborine, like over in the Crescent Beach area. There's a land bank property, you know, with the trail that goes north. I've seen it in there, which is just totally white. And here we have creeping bellflower. This is another one I would absolutely discourage. I've got it in my yard. It looks like that photo on the left. I mean, it started off with a few plants and then we tried to dig it up and then it just went mad and just started spreading like wildfire. So stay away from that one. Stinking hellebore. This is another one that it's a little weedy. It is toxic. It's like its name suggests, it smells bad, but I don't have a good sense of smell. I have it in my yard, and the main thing just to remember is to deadhead it if you don't want it to spread. I don't think it's the worst weed out there. We do see it pop up here and there. And Cotoneaster, we have a few that are on our species of concern list, and this is one of them, Cotoneaster horizontalis. And this one I see occasionally in forested areas, but again, it doesn't seem to be hugely aggressive. So it's just one to be watchful about. Stinking iris, and this is another one that we haven't seen anything quite like this. I think this is the photo from New Zealand, but I have seen spots where it is spreading from neighboring formal landscapes, like out in the south entrance to Turtleback, you know, that trailhead. There's some right along the water there. So it is getting around. I have some of this too in my yard. I have a lot of these. So we're almost at the end. So these are some of the resources that I rely on frequently. I guess I'll point out the books first. Wild Plants of Seattle, if you don't mind line drawings of plants. Arthur Lee Jacobson, retired botanist for the University of Washington. It's a really entertaining book. He's a very vivid writer, entertaining. He talks a lot about edibles. But also he covers a lot of the weeds that you often wonder, what is that? And you know, usually you don't have the time or the knowledge to figure it out. But he covers a lot of those smaller weeds that you probably wondered about from time to time. Another one, a classic, is Weeds of the West, which I think has more of an interior west bias, not so much the West Coast, but more to the east of the Cascades and west of the Rockies. But a very good guide. Been around for a while. And the one I rely on heavily comes out of the University of California, Davis. It's called Weed Control in Natural Areas in the Western US. And this is kind of my Bible. because it covers all the different control techniques for each species. It covers a lot of the same plants we have. It's just very succinct and well written. And as far as the resources, I've mentioned the Washington State Noxious Weed Board. That's a great website I go to again and again. WSU Extension Master Gardeners, you guys, some of you, they have a lot of good resources and they have people on the ground who can help. And University Extension, so this would be WSU, OSU, University of Idaho, and so on. Anywhere in the country, I like going to their websites if they're an extension website. We Research and Information Center, that's UC Davis. Pacific Northwest Weed Management Handbook. They're pretty well concentrated just on chemicals, so I don't use that a whole lot, but once in a while I'll look at that. And then there's the Weed Science Society of America, if you really want to get into the science behind weeds. That would be a good resource. And then the UW, University of Washington Herbarium. Washington State also has an herbarium. There's actually a consortium of herbaria in the Northwest, University of British Columbia and others. And iNaturalist, I don't know how many people here have used that yet. I haven't yet, but if you are curious about plants, you can use this app and basically it will, if not identify, at least get you close to what that plant might be. So integrated weed management, since this is supposed to be about weed warriors, we'll talk about IWM, which is similar to integrated pest management, or IPM. And so you have prevention, mechanical or manual approach, biological, I've already mentioned, cultural, and then chemical, which I know some of you would rather not talk about that, but we'll mention it. So prevention would be things like, okay, you've got your boat, you're traveling from a lake infested with Eurasian water milfoil, you want to go to another lake, and basically you want to clean off your boat before you go into that next lake. I think that's how we got Eurasian water milfoil in our county, is somebody traveled from outside and brought it in. This lower right, basically if you're doing any kind of earth moving, any kind of machinery that you go into an infested site, you want to make sure you clean it off before you go to a clean site. And here, this photo is a classic book, Wild Plants of the San Juan Islands, which most of you probably have used. And I have it here just because knowledge is a way of prevention too. If you're familiar with the species, you're less likely to propagate them or cause them to spread. Here's a neat little tool that we have a few of these. Didn't bring any today, but basically it's a boot brush with a little pick on it. So if you're traveling in an area with a lot of invasive species, you can use this to clean off your shoes or your clothing. The Washington Invasive Species Council really is pushing this play, clean, go message, which I think is a good one. And then lower left, this is just basically plant selection, making sure you're selecting the right plants to begin with. These are house plants, but you can pretend that they're outdoors. Because there are still plants sold out there that are not on the list, or perhaps the owner of the nursery doesn't know that they shouldn't be sold. So educating yourself beforehand before you make those purchases. So the cultural side of it is things like preparing a site, a bed for seeding. If you are going to seed a bare ground site, it's good to do so like in the early fall. And that way you don't have to expend as much energy or water on getting it to establish. Fire is another cultural technique, not one that we promote very often because people are very jumpy about that, but can be used to prepare a site. Usually it results in a lot of weeds coming up, however. So Nature Conservancy has covered that. Lower right, this is plastic, which I normally don't recommend. Gail lives down in an area off of Killebrew Lake Road, and we had, gosh, I don't know, it was a big patch of plastic basically to smother meadow knapweed, and it worked, but as soon as we peeled it off, a bunch of other weeds came up. And then it became a large landfill problem. But it is something you can use maybe in some situations to suppress weeds. If they have a long seed life, don't forget it. It's not going to do much. I like this approach. Coarse wood chips works for a lot of weeds. It's not going to work on some noxious weeds, but if you have a thick coating of wood chips, that can suppress a lot of your weeds in a landscape setting. So those are cultural. And these are some of the tools. So the weed wrench I mentioned in the upper right, we do have those on loan. This is what Nancy Jones used to call a dandelion picker. And that's a pretty handy tool. I've also heard it called an asparagus fork. Hori, this is something I use a lot. This one's called Grandpa's Weeder. You can get it online. It's like 30 bucks or so. And this is good for things like dandelions. It just pops them right out of the ground. Weed trimmers, you can get these with either a string or with a metal blade attachment, like if you have blackberry. This is the latest. This is something the land bank has got. It's one of these radio controlled mowers that can go across blackberry. Pretty slick, but undoubtedly expensive. And then you have electric chainsaws or trimmers like this now that have come out, really lightweight. If you're dealing with things like English holly or hawthorn, those would be a good investment potentially. Then you have your standard loppers, hand pruners. This is a little buckthorn blaster, which I'll get into in a moment. So the chemical, and I know a lot of you don't want to talk about this. I actually, when I was with OSU in their Master Gardener program, I remember distinctly one of the speakers, I think he was their president, who was telling us about chemicals and how we needed to get right with that. And I thought, God, that's really offensive that he would be promoting that message. I think he was a nursery or orchard owner. But years later, I've come to realize he was right. You don't have to deal with all weeds with chemicals, but for certain things, it makes the job much easier and basically turning a 10-year project into a 1 or 2 year project. And we try to be very careful with what we use. There are dozens of different active ingredients out there. We only use 4 or 5 of them. So we're very mindful of environmental impact, human health, and so on. You can't possibly know everything about that chemical because sometimes the information isn't available to you. So I've come to realize that in a limited way, it's a useful tool. And for the typical gardener, this is probably the most widely used tool for folks that I've introduced this to. It's the buckthorn blaster. So it's just a little bottle, but you can cut a woody plant to the ground and then paint it immediately, and that will take care of it. So that's a pretty handy tool. It's not all over the environment. It's just going on that cut surface and down into the roots. So I think some people manage to live with that. This is a small scale example of boom spraying. This is something we don't do, but just showing you that it's an option. This is more what we do is backpack spraying. Here, this is something called basil bark. I don't know if you can see it very well, but it's got kind of a reddish color. That's just a dye that they add to the product. And basically, you're just spraying the base of the plant. It's got like an oil carrier, about 20 or 30% of it, I think. And then it just soaks into the bark and kills the plant. And the other thing is the drones, which again, I'm not real comfortable with that, but it is something that we're starting to see more of, like in agricultural settings, places where you may have many, many acres of weeds. This is an approach now that's being used, but not one that I personally would do. So that's the chemical. And the biological I mentioned earlier, we have different insects, and the federal government goes through a very lengthy process in trying to vet out candidates. They'll pick insects that they find in the native host country of whatever weed it is they're dealing with, and they'll test them over a number of years with other plants that are non-target species to see if the biological control agent will jump to that other plant. And if it does, then they just wipe it off for consideration. So we have a number of those in the county. And of course, you have goats and sheep. Those are sometimes used for biological control too. We haven't been able to find anybody out here who would have a service like that. It's something we've been interested in. But so far, we haven't had any takers. It takes quite a lot of management to get a herd of goats out there, but they will eat blackberry, as you can see. So again, we've talked about definitions of noxious weeds, the law, some of the impacts of noxious weeds, some of the weeds that you'll encounter in the San Juans, some of the resources, both websites and books, and then I went over integrated weed management And I think that's it. Here's our contact information again. But I'll show you this slide. These are folks who volunteer for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Before the pandemic, we would go out in the spring and the fall. And it was a lot of fun. We would go out to each of the little islands that they have, and you'd see a lot of great wildflowers. It's the best way to see them, I think. And these were all volunteers that call themselves the weed warriors, and they would go out and work on various weeds. But it was a lot of fun. Unfortunately, the pandemic kind of did away with all that, but I hope to get out there again. So yeah, that's it. I guess you probably have some questions. Yes.
I used to live in Portland, and the English ivy down there, and also the, I call it Travelers Road, I think you call it Old Man something, were killing Doug fir forests.
Yeah.
I mean, going up, and so they have 3 or 4 times a year, volunteers cut the English ivy around the base,
Yeah.
you know, get out of it, but, you know, I've got segments of ivy stems. So is that something we might do here? Because we've got English ivy coming into East Sound.
Yeah, I would love to. I mean, I've been approached about that a number of times. Like, well, don't you have like a volunteer group that goes out? And I would love to do that. Yeah, if we can get a group of people once a month or once every few months.
Yeah.
I would welcome that.
It
I could bring the muffins and the coffee. People come. Yeah, it's a great idea. And you know, a lot of times we have to get permission before we enter people's properties, but if it's close enough to the road, yeah, it's generally okay. And the way to deal with English ivy, I've actually worked on that in Seattle myself. Carkeep Park, we spent close to a month, and we would just cut it and then we roll it up like a big carpet. So yeah, around here, we're kind of lucky because the deer will eat a lot of the ivy on the ground. So what you typically see on Orcas, at least, is just the stuff climbing the trees, not much on the ground. But if you go to Waldron, they don't have deer. And so it's spreading all over the ground. So I'm supposed to help them. I've been invited to stay out there and overnight and work on their ivy. But yeah, I think that's a great idea to have a party like that. Get that started. Any other questions? Sure.
There's one from Chad.
Okay.
What is the best way to treat noxious weeds on waterfront high bank that can't be dug up safely?
Oh boy, that's a tough question. So if you're talking about a steep bank, like a feeder bluff, for example, I dealt with this recently with Scotch broom over on Kilbrew Lake Road, right near the ferry landing. And unless I have climbing gear, I can't get down there to deal with it anyway. And you have to think about bank stabilization. Do you want to get rid of it or just leave it? So it's a tough one. I know people have English ivy, they're the same concern, or Himalayan blackberry. I've had disagreements with that with our community development folks because you're not supposed to clear vegetation on those sorts of shoreline environments. But if this person wants me to come out and have a look, I'd be happy to do that. And we could talk with community development, see if we can come up with a plan. But yeah, that's a really tough site. And I'm kind of ambivalent about what to do.
Thank you. One more.
Yeah.
What's in buckthorn blaster?
Well, it's a little plastic bottle. See if I can find it. You can find it online. It's just a little plastic bottle. And basically you buy it from the North American Invasive Species Management Association out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And what you do is you just fill it up with an herbicide, something that's systemic that'll go down to the roots. And I always add a little bit of dye to it, a dye marker, so that you can see where you painted. And then you just cut the plant to the ground and you immediately dab it on the cut surface. And it's called buckthorn blaster because there's an invasive woody species in that part of the country in the Midwest called buckthorn, which I think is rhamnus. I don't remember the Latin name, but anyway, we use that frequently. Yes, Tony.
As you can say, that buckthorn blaster that you showed me works just great with Himalayan blackberry.
Yeah.
Pop it off at the ground, use very little herbicide. You don't have to worry about it drifting onto your neighbor's property.
Yeah, that's the attractive thing about it.
Is there a certain time to use it?
Well, it's a good question. You can use it just about any time of year, but as you know from plant biology, in the early spring, you're going to get the sap flowing up to the tops. So that probably wouldn't be the best time to do it. And you also probably wouldn't want to do it when it's really drought stressed. The plant may not take it in. But any other time or really cold conditions, you wouldn't want to necessarily do it. If it's below freezing, it probably wouldn't work out. But any other time, fall is probably the optimal time, but I do it virtually year round. Yeah.
And another follow-up question, does it work on Scotch broom?
Oh, yes, it does. Yeah. But the key is you have to cut it close to the ground. If you cut it too high, like a foot or so, and then paint it, it may not work. And the other thing to keep in mind is the smaller the stem size, the diameter of the plant, the less likely it is to work. So if you get bigger ones, it's more likely. But I should point out also that if you have a bigger stump, you only have to apply it to the cambium layer. So that's the outermost layer close to the bark, because that's the part that translocates into the roots. You don't have to paint the entire cut surface, which, you know, if you're dealing with it over and over like I am, that matters because you want to conserve the amount of material you're using. But for most people, it's the entire surface is probably fine.
And a comment. Ann Rowley wants to thank Jason for his help on Shore Drive with Iliad Agenus. I'm going to mispronounce it, but the property owners have removed it all.
Oh, that's good to know. Thank you, Ann. Glad something worked. That's a lot of the trick is I write these letters of notification and I'm constantly tinkering with the message because I want to encourage people to do it, but not to be heavy-handed about it. And it's a lot of it's just about the right wording. It's like if I had background in marketing, it'd probably help a lot. So yeah, if you guys have any ideas, I mean, sometimes it's just putting the fear of punishment is the best approach. And that's kind of at the second or third letter, you start to get more stern. Yeah, thanks, Ann.
That's it from the virtual world.
Yeah, well, I can always come back, but at least you got a speaker. May not be the one you wanted. Here, let's go back to that person. I wonder how to get to that person. It's had to go really fast. That's such a great cartoon, though. Yeah, I've only scratched the surface, by the way. There's many, many more. Yeah, sorry. There must be a faster way to go to the beginning.
While you're doing that, one more question just came in.
Yeah.
Without knowing it was invasive, I have Italian arum in my garden bed. I have control by pulling, but how concerned should I be? And how does it spread?
That's one of those plants that if you have it and it isn't disturbed, I'd probably just recommend removing the red berries or the green berries when it gets to that stage. That happens sometime in the summer or early fall. But if you try to dig it up, you have to be really, really careful and try to get all the roots. And that's really tough again, because it's got these tiny little tubers that are pea-sized. So that's why I've been telling people, you may just want to dig up the soil too, put that in a bag. It's very heavy. And we'll take it at the dump. I didn't mention that, but noxious weeds will be, most of them will be taken at the dump, no charge, including Italian arum. But that's a really tough one. If he doesn't have a lot of it, you may just want to remove the fruits and bag that and leave it alone. But if it's spreading, then yeah, she might have me out there and have a look. Yes.
So when it's really wet ground is when I usually try to deal with getting thistles, so I can try to get as much root as possible. Because it's really painful when those thistles are attached.
Yeah.
But I guess part of me is like, so if there's any part of the thistle root in the ground, it can still keep growing, or?
Well, with bull thistle, I think you only need a couple of inches from what I've read. But some other species that may be true. I know with Canada thistle, any fragment left in the ground, even if it's 1/4 of an inch, can potentially generate a new plant.
And then I thought it was interesting that you were putting Scott's broom instead of Scotch.
Yeah,
Or are we trying to get away from?
that's just my preference. Yeah, there was a joke I heard years ago from a friend, and I think the person was from Scotland, and he was asked by an American, "Are you Scotch?" And his response was, "Scotch, that's something you drink. I'm Scottish." So I tried to say Scots instead, but I think if you look at the state list, it says Scotch. So that's just me. Yeah. All right, thanks you guys. I'm around, I'm just down the road. If you guys want any of these materials, I'll leave them here for you. But we have everything online too, so help yourselves either. And thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason.
Right.
As Laura said, this happened for a reason, and that is because it's the time to go out and start looking for all these weeds in our yards, right? And especially the spurge laurel. Just to let y'all, give you a heads up about his collaborative approach, my neighborhood, which is small, is covered by spurge laurel. And he's actually inspired a group of neighbors who don't even live there to all meet next Wednesday to deal with Scotch broom as a group. So we're gonna do like 3 or 4 hours of, finding and eliminating. So that's something that's a smaller scale than getting a whole group to do English ivy in town and just get your neighborhood association to do a party, So anyway,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
That's
This was great and perfect timing. We really appreciate you stepping up on really short notice. It's great. Thank you.
Okay.